Hi, my name is Alistair Chapman, and in this video I want to take a look at this camera from Sony. This is the FX30, and as you can see, just looking at the camera, it's very similar to the FX3. It's pretty much the same body. A few differences: the inserts for the quarter-inch, quarter-20 tripod mounts are black instead of grey, but pretty much it's the same camera body. Now the big difference, of course, between this and the FX30 is that this has a Super 35 sensor, and if we look in here you can see, compared to an FX30, it's a relatively small sensor. So it's actually APSC, not Super 35. And you know what? I really like this camera. It's really cheap. It's about $2,000, they're around 2,000 euros, around that sort of price. So it's very affordable. And I'm quite sure a lot of people will be looking at maybe buying an FX30 that perhaps currently use Sony's FS7, good old workhorse camera, or perhaps just as a B camera to an FX6, FX9. So what I really wanted to understand about this camera was, how does it compare to the FS7, to the FX3, and of course the FX6 and FX9. So I did a lot of testing, measuring things like dynamic range and image performance, as well as actually using the camera. So I've used it to shoot circus, I've used it on gimbal extensively, and you know what, I really do like this camera. I'm a long-time FX9 owner, and one of the things that I've always liked about my FX9 is that, as well as being full frame, it has the ability to shoot in Super 35. Now this is APS-C, which is more or less the equivalent of Super 35, so it means that I can put a PL adapter on this camera and use it with standard cinema 35mm PL lenses without any issue, things like the Fujinon MK lenses, and it gives me a really broad range of lenses that I can use. And the lens that I've kind of almost sort of fallen in love with this setup is the lens that I have on here right now, which is the Sony 18-105 power zoom. Now this was a lens that I often had on my FS5 or FS7. It's an f4, constant f4. It's kind of parfocal. I wouldn't call it truly parfocal, but you can zoom in and zoom out during your shots with this lens, especially if you use autofocus, and the focus will track. So what that means is that this package here, like this, is very portable. I have the little zoom control here on the top of the grip. It's not as fine a control as you get perhaps with the zoom rocker on the FX6 or FX9, but it's very usable. I can zoom in and out during my shots, and I can kind of get that sort of really nice run and gun type operation that in some regards maybe the full frame cameras are struggling to deliver, because if you want a parfocal zoom, it tends to be very big and very bulky, especially if you want f4 and things like that, or faster. And just generally, I don't know, there's just something about going back to Super 35 that's really nice. Now, a few other things about this camera is that this sensor is, when it's operating in its video mode, is approximately 6K. So we're recording in 4K using the XAVC SI or HS codecs, and we're downsampling from 6K. So that means that the resolution of the images is really good. And I did some very basic resolution tests just to have a look at this. And what I can see is that the FX30 delivers, if anything, compared to the FX6, very slightly higher resolution in the recorded image. Now these differences are very small, and whether you'd actually see them in the real world, I'm not entirely convinced. But it's certainly not any worse than the FX6, FX9, all those cameras. So it holds its own in terms of resolution quite comfortably, if anything perhaps has an edge over the FX6. Now one of the things that can occasionally be a little bit troublesome on the FX6 is coloured moiré. And if we look at this test here, this chart is designed to show up those sorts of issues, aliasing and moiré. We can see that the FX6 suffers from quite pronounced coloured moiré, which the FX30, the cheaper camera, doesn't suffer from. So that's actually quite a nice positive for the FX30. Comparing it to the FS7, it's actually slightly better than the FS7 as well. And I think that's simply because we're sampling at a higher rate. The optical low-pass filter, etc., can be tuned a bit better for 4K, and because of that, we're getting less moiré, less aliasing from the FX30. So it really does very well in that area. But what about noise and dynamic range? Because obviously that's really important too. Well, the FX30 does very, very well there. Now, Sony only claim 14 stops for the FX30, but they claim 15 plus stops for the FX3, FX6, etc. Now, what's quite interesting is the Sony, when you talk to Sony about the FX30's dynamic ranges, they'll actually say it's more than 14 stops. So I put the cameras in front of my homemade dynamic range test chart to have a look at this to see if I could, what differences I could find. And now a couple of things here. This is a homemade chart. It's a homemade test device. It isn't 100% accurate, but it should allow me to see any certainly significant differences in dynamic range between these cameras. And the reality is I'm struggling to find a difference between the FX30 and the FX6. And in fact, even the FS7 isn't that far behind. I think the FS7 does suffer though, because when we start looking at the images from the FS7 at its base ISO of 2000 ISO, what we find is they're quite noisy. And that noise really limits the shadow range. So if you're shooting with an FS7, you'd very often want to expose a stop brighter at the base ISO if you're using log to really get the best from it, perhaps even a stop and a half. But because the FX6, FX3, FX30 are that much quieter with less noise, certainly at 800 ISO, we don't need to do that. And we can make much better use of that shadow range while retaining the same highlight range. So what that means in practice is that the FX30, FX3, FX6, etc. all deliver a little bit more dynamic range than the FS7. Now the other thing, of course, about the FX30 is it has Sony's new color science, the same, or at least it's related to the color science from Sony Venice cameras and S-Cinetone. So another quick test that I did was to make sure that there weren't any major issues, that the FX30 would match my FX6, etc. And as you can see here, this is with S-Cinetone. They are very, very similar. Now, they're not identical. I did notice a very, very slight difference in the skin tones, but I think this is so minor that in a two-camera shoot with two different shots from two different angles, you're really not going to see this when you cut between the shots. In S-Log, again, very, very similar, almost look identical. Again, there is a slight difference. They're not absolutely identical, but they are close enough that I really don't think that it's a problem, and you'll be able to mix and match these cameras very closely on a shoot. Certainly the FX30 is much, much closer to the rest of the cinema line cameras, FX6, etc., than the FS7 is, and the FS7 doesn't have that new S-Cinetone curve either. Now, another thing I wanted to look at though was the dual ISO function. So the FX30 has dual base ISOs, and those are in S-Log3, they are 800 and 2500. Now, if we compare that to the FX6, the FX6 is 800 and 12,800. Now, what I will say, and all my testing really sort of confirmed this, that in terms of working in extremely low light, the FX6 and the FX3 are still the winners in that area. That 12,800 base ISO really does work remarkably well at very, very low light levels. But the FX30 isn't actually that far behind because, again, we're oversampling. We're starting at 6K, and that really helps to bring the noise levels down. So actually, in terms of working in what I would say is most lower light levels, the FX30 is perfectly capable and perfectly able to do it. Now, one image defect that I have discovered, and well, I've seen it before from other people's tests with the FX30, is image smear. So if we look at the test that I did for dynamic range, where we have these really bright stops that are very, very close to clipping, you can see that there is a brighter band that goes across the darker parts of the image, and that's called smear. Now, most CMOS sensors do actually do it, and in fact the FX6 and the FX3 do it as well. And if you look carefully in the dynamic range test that I did with the FX6 here, you can see that there's some smear with the FX6 as well, but it's not as pronounced. Now on the FX30, if you do have an extremely bright highlight against a very dark background, you are going to get this smear phenomenon. How much of an issue is it? I'm not overly concerned about it because I know it's there, because through my testing I've seen it. So I will try to avoid those situations where I can. And I also think that in most situations, most people probably won't notice it. And it is only with something that's virtually clipped. And if you take an example of a shot, perhaps where you've got the sky as the top half of your shot, and that's very, very bright, and then the bottom half of your shot is your normal foreground, you're really not going to see or notice that smear. It's just not going to be something that will be visibly noticeable in the picture. So it is there. It's something to be aware of. Is it something that should stop you from buying the camera? I really don't think so. I really don't think it's that bad an issue. And possibly in later firmware updates, maybe Sony will be able to improve the situation a little bit. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. But just be aware of it. It certainly didn't stop me from buying the camera, because actually after testing it with a sample that Sony lent me, this is my own camera. I went out and I bought one, and I'm really pleased with it, really happy with it. This is actually going to be my sort of go-to camera on gimbals. It's going to be my go-to camera for a lot of run and gun stuff where I just want something really small and compact that will just fit in my pocket, because it will. If you've got a really big pocket, it will go in it. Certainly compared to using the FX3 perhaps with the 18 to 1, the 24 to 105, you have a bigger zoom range. In a similar size package, but this is a power zoom now, and you can zoom in and out during the shot quite nicely, compared to the FX3 with the 28 to 135, which is kind of a similar zoom range to this. Then it's a much bigger consideration, much bigger and more expensive. This lens is only $500, 500 euros. It's a really cheap lens. So if you are thinking about buying a new camera, and perhaps if you're looking at the FS7, a used FS7, these can be picked up really cheaply, and you are getting a lot of camera with the FS7. I'm not trying to say there's anything wrong with the FS7 at all. You might also want to consider the FX30, because you'll probably get your FX30 for less than you'll get a used FS7. It will be brand new, it will have a warranty, it has all the new codecs, XAVC HS, it can shoot 120 frames per second in 4K, although there is a crop, quite a big crop when you do that, because it reads a 1:1 pixel readout at 120 frames per second, so there's a fairly substantial crop. But it does get you into the new color science, the new S-Cinetone gamma, S-Log3 with Cine EI with LUTs is all there. We now have embedded LUTs, and I'll be doing a separate video about embedded LUTs now and what that means and how that works. So I really rate this camera. It performs really well. I'm not convinced actually there's any significant difference in dynamic range between this and the FX3 or FX6, even the FX9. It's more or less the same as far as I can tell. And other than that smear issue, it's a really good camera. I mean, in terms of rolling shutter, other people have discussed rolling shutter. Yes, it has more rolling shutter than an FX3 or an FX6, but it has a similar amount to an FS7. It's not that much different. So I really like it. Gets a big thumbs up from me. As I say, this is my own. I'm really enjoying shooting with this camera. This is so small, so light and compact. Take a look at it for yourself if you're not sure. As always, if you're buying a new camera, looking at a new camera, my recommendation is to hire one, rent one, borrow one, scrounge one, get one, go out and use it and see if it's for you before you make your own decision. So thank you for watching. If you like this video, if you found any of the things in this video useful, please do subscribe. I do appreciate your subscriptions, and come back soon for more. Thank you. Bye-bye.